Good evening. Howdy. If you would, turn your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 22. 2 Kings chapter 22. It's good to see each of you this evening. It's been a nice day today outside. Heard some of you got in a nap or two. Guess it's a good day for it. 2 Kings 22, I'd like to read the first two verses of that chapter. The first two verses of that chapter. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. He did right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the way of his father David, nor did he turn aside to the right or to the left. 8 years old when he became king. Josiah is called one of those good kings that we have in Judah, one that tried to follow God the best way that they could. He had a long reign, 31 years in Judah. But he reigned in the last days of Judah just before they started their downward demise as far as being taken over by other forces were concerned and other nations were concerned. And the way the nation got to this point was over many, many years. If you go back to 2 Kings 21, we see a man whose name Manasseh came to the throne. Now that is Josiah's grandfather. His name is Manasseh. And he ruled anywhere from 52 to 55 years. Can you imagine? Over Judah. Now Manasseh was an evil king. He was a wicked king. And if you look at some of the things that he did, he rebuilt the high places, which Hezekiah, his father, had torn down in verse 3. He built altars to various gods actually within Solomon's temple, to the sky, and to the Asherah, and to the Baal, and so forth. So he really was very vigorous in bringing idol worship back into Judah, if you will, that his father Hezekiah had done away with. He put actually a carved image of the Asherah in the very temple itself and sacrificed to those gods on the burnt offering of the altar of the Solomon, that altar was set aside for the burnt offerings for God. Even into the holy place and even to the most holy place, he put these idols, if you can imagine, to these foreign gods. Not only that, but he practiced human sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom, where the temple of Molech was. And you would go there and you would offer, he had his son pass through the fire. He sacrificed, human sacrificed his son, one of his sons, in that valley, if you will. And he did a lot of very, very bad things. And it made him, and you notice down here in verse 8 of chapter 21, he said, "And I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave the fathers, if they only will observe to do, God said, that I've commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they did not listen," verse 9. "And Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel." So Manasseh seduced Judah into doing more evil than the actual idol nations that were there when Joshua came and conquered the land. So could we say that the nation was in a pretty low point spiritually at this time? Could we say that? That they were pretty low spiritually. Here was a king, a leader, who brought in all these idols that even had human sacrifice, if you will, a king of Judah now. Did these things and so forth. Now we learn, if you look in 2 Kings and if you look in the Chronicles as well, in 2 Chronicles chapter 33, that God sent the king of Assyria against him and captured him and took him by hooks back to the capital of Assyria. Now, when they say hooks, what they do is they take these hooks and they put them in your body, on your shoulders, and they put them in the blades, and they put them in your nose, and they put them in your arms, and they drag you. They make you walk that way back to the capital of Assyria. A long way, hundreds of miles. And so while he's there, believe it or not, he gets it. I shouldn't have been doing that. I shouldn't have been putting idols in the nation. I should have been doing this and been doing that. And if you look at 2 Chronicles, he's released and he comes back to Judah and he takes down all the idols. And he starts serving God again, even though he left the high places, if you will, that were left. And so he caused this nation to go into this calamity. And because of that, the point is that God said, because of what Manasseh did, it has filled up the cup of Judah, therefore I'm going to send them into captivity. I'm going to send them into captivity because of the culmination of what Manasseh did concerning Judah following him into idolatry. Now, after Manasseh dies, his son Amon comes to the throne. And you notice there in verse 19 of chapter 21, he was 22 years old when he became king. And he reigned 2 years. And the reason he reigned 2 years, he was so bad, he brought back in the idols that his father had learned his lesson from. He brings back in the idols, and he's so bad a king that the people around him kill him. But then the people of Judah turn around and kill the people that killed Amon. Things are bad, aren't they? Things are bad in Judah. Think about it. This is about the lowest in Judah's ever been in its history at this point, and then an 8-year-old boy comes to the throne. Think about it. This is about as low as Judah has ever been in its 500-year history, and here comes an 8-year-old on the throne whose name is Josiah. But what we learn about Josiah is he's totally different from his grandfather and from his father Amon. When he becomes 16 years old, it says he began to know the gods of his fathers, the fathers of David. And then by age 20, he started reforms in the nation. And these reforms are spectacular reforms. He repairs the temple. Solomon's temple had been in disrepair. So he takes the money that had been appropriated for that, and he gives them over to the priests, who gives them over to the carpenters and the workmen, and they work on Solomon's temple and they repair it. Can you imagine? Solomon's temple is about 450 years old at this point. Can you imagine a building sitting around for 450 years going to need some repair, right? So he repairs the temple. Not only that, while they're repairing the temple, they find a book. The Book of the Covenant. And the priests have the book taken to Josiah and read in his presence. When he hears the Book of the Covenant, he tears his clothes and says, "We have sinned a great sin against God. And we've got to do something. We've got to straighten this out." And so in chapter 23, we see over here that he renews the covenant with God, beginning at verse 1. Then the king sent, and they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. And he read it in the hearing of all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and testimonies. So here's this Josiah, 8 years old as king, 16 years old he came to know Jehovah. 20 years old, he begins all his reforms. Kind of a young man, isn't it? But a strong young man. And then he says, we're going to renew this covenant here. And they make sacrifices and so forth. And not only that, but he begins to reform to get rid of all the idols in the land. He gets all the idols out of the temple. He gets all the idols out of the city. He gets even the high places he destroys. The high places, by the way, that Solomon built, and temples were in Jerusalem that Solomon had built were still there to these foreign gods, to his wives. He had those destroyed. Can you imagine? They've been there 400 years. So he wipes all of that out, and he goes into the countryside in Judah, and he wipes out all the high places and the idols that were these foreign gods. Not only that, he goes north to Bethel, where Jeroboam had that golden calf that he built a long time ago. This is Jehovah. He had that torn down and ground into powder. And not only that, but he gathers up the priests, the Baal priests, and all those who wouldn't repent, and he had them executed. Every one of them. Every one of them. Can you imagine the reform that's going on? It took him years to do it, but he got it done. This one king erased all the idol worship that had been going on for 400 years. And not only that, but he reinstituted the Passover, that they observe it. And the Bible tells us the Passover in Josiah's time, it hadn't been observed that way since the time of the judges. Think about that. Since the time of the judges, since the time of Samuel, the Passover has not been observed the way it had been observed in the time of Josiah. And not only that, but he got rid of the mediums and spiritists in the land. Those who spoke to the dead, supposedly. Those who would read the constellations and tell people's fortunes thinking that's something. Leading people away from God by those things. And he got rid of all those things. However, the king of Egypt was going to war against Assyria. And Josiah went out to war against him, the Pharaoh. He was warned not to do it. And he goes out to war. And even Pharaoh tells him, don't come out to war against me because I've got to go against Assyria because the Lord told me that I need to do this. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. And so Pharaoh goes out to fight against Assyria. Josiah goes out to meet him. Josiah is shot. He's taken back to Jerusalem and he dies. But he's a man, right? Men make mistakes. But he's still a good king. So you have Judah on this downward spiral. Manasseh takes them into this low point. He reforms somewhat. But his son Amon comes in and reinstitutes everything that his father had done away with after he had come back and learned his lesson. Judah was at a low point in their existence. God in that point said, I'm not turning back. I'm going to send them into, if you will, exile. Josiah comes, and the Lord looks at what Josiah has done and says, I tell you what, Josiah, you've done a lot of good things. And because you've done a lot of good things, I'm not going to send them into captivity while you're king. I'm going to wait because you repented, because you did all these things. I'm not sending them into exile while you're king. It's going to be after you rest with your fathers. And then, of course, as you know, as the story unfolds, you have Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, the exiles in 606, 596, and 586, culminating in the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC. Just to give you a little, time reference here, Josiah was king from 640 to 609 BC. So Josiah dies in 609, and you math people, 21 years later, Solomon's temple is destroyed. So, after he dies. Okay. After he dies. So as we look at this story here of God, if you will, working in the lives of a kingdom, What spiritual lessons can we take from this story? Well, I think first of all, one of the spiritual lessons that we can take from this story is that strong leaders can change the spiritual fortunes of a nation. You believe that? They can. Strong leaders can change the spiritual fortunes of a nation. Most people are followers. If we had leaders who were spiritual, most people would get in line. It's just the way it is. But if you've got leaders who pander to every whim that comes down the pike, that's what's going to happen. People look for strong leaders. They desire strong leaders. And here comes King Josiah. Think about it. Manasseh had led them into total depravity. I mean, they had male and female temple prostitutes in Solomon's temple that he got rid of. Can you imagine? In the house of God, prostitutes? They're supposed to be godly prostitutes, and they're doing all this mess in the name of Jehovah, in the name of these idols? How low did it get? And then Josiah turned it around. He turned it around. Strong leaders can change the spiritual fortunes of a nation if the leaders would stand up and do it. Amen. Don't say it wouldn't happen. Don't say it wouldn't happen. I think another spiritual lesson that we can learn from this is that really all nations are on a time clock for judgment. We are. Every nation that has ever existed from day one has been on a time clock for judgment. How many nations that existed 1,000 years ago stand today as they were constituted 1,000 years ago? None. Oh, you could say back in the Middle Ages, countries like France and countries like Great Britain and countries like Germany got their roots, if you will, from those things. But they're far different from what they used to be. They're not even close. And we're not either. We're not close to what we were 250 years ago, if you will. Nations change. They go through different stages and so forth. And every nation is on a time clock to judgment. And that judgment can be stayed or that judgment can be sped up depending upon the spiritual state of that nation. Think about it. Judah was going into the pits of hell with Manasseh and Amon. God said unto Manasseh, I can't let this stand anymore. Josiah comes along and he stays it for a while. He does. God looks at Josiah and says, well, I'm not going to do it while you're king. I'm going to delay it. If we just had spiritual leaders to stand up, maybe judgments can be delayed for this country a little bit longer. Or any country in the world. We're not talking about the United States. We're talking about all countries in the world. We're not alone in this. We're not alone. Perhaps God will have mercy upon the nations of the world if they just treat people right. Just treat people right. Just act like a nation. Just act like you care. I'm not saying that every nation and everybody has to be a Christian. I wish they were. But the criteria for a God is, does that God acknowledge God as God, and do they treat people right? Look at the Old Testament. For a nation to exist. Does that nation acknowledge God as God, and how do they treat one another? The two criteria. I think a third spiritual lesson that we can learn from this is that anyone can turn around their life to an extent. Think about Manasseh. What did it take to turn Manasseh around? It took them putting hooks in his body and dragging him to the capital of Assyria. Was that an object lesson or what? Was that an object lesson? It took that to turn him around. God knew it would take that to turn him around. And the men realized, wait a minute, look what I've been doing. Remember who his father was, Hezekiah. His father's Hezekiah. He was a good king. Hezekiah didn't teach him to worship idols. Hezekiah did away with the idols in the land. So he had that background. He had a father who was a godly man. He had the background. He knew better. But when it took the hammer to change him. Sometimes, brethren, it takes the hammer to change a nation. Which is sad. That's scary. It is scary to me. And it's not just today. It's been happening for 150 years, guys. You know, we blame this generation baloney. It's my generation too. We've failed this nation. Generation before me failed this nation to an extent. Going slowly into this. All generations are to blame. Don't blame the young people, guys. It's been going on for 150 years. The slow degrade. So he turned around, didn't he? He turned around. And a nation can turn around. And a person can turn around. But sometimes it takes a hammer, doesn't it? You know, they say about alcoholics, you got to hit rock bottom, right? Before you realize that you got a problem. I think another spiritual lesson that we can learn from this story, that even the great ones have their faults, don't they? Josiah wasn't supposed to go to war. He wasn't supposed to fight the Egyptian Pharaoh. He went out on his own and did it. And he paid the cost, didn't he? Even the great ones have their faults. Moses struck the rock, right? Abraham lied, did he not? Adam and Eve ate what they shouldn't have eaten. Peter denied the Lord 3 times. And we could go on and on and on, right? Even in our lives. I'm not the great ones. We're not the great ones, but you know what I'm saying. We, if you will, fail from time to time. But that's okay, because we got a Lord that can lift us up. And nations can fail from time to time, but thanks be unto God that He has the capacity to lift us up. That He blesses the nation because of the people that are in it who are doing good. His children, if you will, also. That He blesses that nation. But we all have our faults, don't we? But thanks be to God, He's there to lift us up. Peter had the Lord. Moses had God. Right? To lift him up. To bring him back to where he needed to be. And so as we look at King Josiah, and as we looked at what's going on in Judah, I don't think we've got to the point of Manasseh yet in this country. I don't think we're close to that. But do we need a Josiah? Does every nation need a Josiah? Yes, not just us. Every nation needs a Josiah. Leaders that would be willing to stand up and do what is right in the eyes of God. And people will follow, by the way. They will. They will. So with these thoughts in mind, if there's anyone here tonight who needs anything at all, whether it be prayer or whatever it be in your life, we know that the invitation is always open, but we're here, and if there's anything that you need at all, please come and stand and sing this song.